Hello, everyone, and welcome to Johnny's Ambassadors Expert Webinar Series for Parents. I am your host, Laura Stack, the founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors, where our mission is to educate parents and teens about the dangers of today's high-potency marijuana products on adolescent brain development, mental illness, and suicide. We have another incredible guest with us today, whom I will introduce in just a moment after I go over a few quick logistics. This session is being recorded. You can share it with your friends and family on this page where you're watching the recording. There is also a handout on this same page, and for those who are watching live, it is available in the control panel of your GoToWebinar. I will be running Dr. Atakan's slides for her for about 45 minutes, where she will make her comments and teach us, and then you will have 15 minutes to ask her questions. So don't wait until the end to type your questions in, because I will read them in the order received. So as you think of them, please type them into the question box. Okay, without any further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Zerrin Atakan. After completing her psychiatric training in Turkey, Dr. Atakan moved to the UK with a research scholarship. In the early 90s, her clinical observation of patients with psychosis becoming unwell again following use of cannabis led her to start doing research on the effects of cannabis in the brain. Since then, she has been one of the pioneers of cannabis research, and her group was one of the first to trace where THC and CBD compounds go in the brain in healthy volunteers. She currently works as a part-time clinician and an honorary senior lecturer and a senior researcher at the neuroimaging section of the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College London, where she continues to study the effects of cannabis compounds on behavior and brain regions. She has written numerous articles on the effects of cannabis in peer-reviewed, high-impact journals, and makes frequent presentations on psychoses and cannabis-related topics. And I want everyone to know that Dr. Zerrin Atakan was one of the very first people who talked with me after Johnny's death. I reached out to her via email and asked some questions, and she was kind enough at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic in March of 2020 to respond to me personally and set up a Zoom call. So you have been so kind, Zerrin, and thank you so much for being one of Johnny's ambassadors.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you. It's you are doing really, as I was saying to you before, something really, really important and valuable. And I think in years to come, you'll see the impact of your work, and that will be very gratifying, I'm sure. So I'm delighted if I could help in a tiny little bit even. Right. Well, today we'll talk about cannabis, and because as Laura said, it was due to a clinical observation that led me to the world of cannabis, and so that's what I'll be talking about today. I'm sure maybe some of the things, if you've been to Johnny's Ambassadors webinars before, some of them may be a repeat, but hopefully it will be useful information for some of you. And we'll also be concentrating on how it may affect the teenager's brain, because that's highly relevant, as you will see. So next, please, Laura. Yes, what we'll be covering is that very briefly, we'll talk about the content of cannabis plants, which I'm sure most of you know that already. And this very interesting endocannabinoid system, we'll talk about that, the history and what it involves and where it is. And then we'll look at the adolescent brain and the effects of THC, and the session with risk factors for psychosis. Next. So let's talk about what is so different about this plant first. Next. Cannabis plant is a complex plant. It has, as plants go, it's got about 143 compounds about 100 terpenes, and so overall about 400 chemicals. So it's not a simple plant. And very interestingly, I mean, it's got, in fact, more, the 4 main compounds, but the most well-known and researched ones are the first 2. That's delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is known as THC, and the other is cannabidiol, which is CBD. These 2 main compounds are, interestingly, have very different effects. So if we could have the next slide, please. If you look at the structure of these, chemical structure of these 2 compounds, THC and cannabidiol, they look very similar. But it's so interesting that, in fact, the effects of them in the body is almost exact opposite. And in fact, our research showed this in so many ways, because what we did was, after the clinical observation that I had with my patients becoming a lot worse after they used cannabis, when they had got better from their psychosis, was that I thought, what is going on? And in those days, in the 90s, that the research was very few. They based on 1960s research, and so we gave 10 milligrams of THC to people and 600 milligrams of cannabidiol and placebo flower. They all looked in nice red capsules, and then looked at and asked the healthy volunteers to do various things, various tasks when they were being scanned. Their brain was scanned so that we could look at the activities in various brain regions. And what we saw, basically, that THC and cannabidiol were doing the opposite things to each other. Next slide. So after this very brief introduction about the cannabis plant, so we'll be mainly focusing on THC. But let's see what happens when someone smokes cannabis. Where does it, or takes cannabis, where does it go in the body? Maybe before we talk about this, for those who are not familiar with the receptor and neurotransmitter system, maybe you know this already, but I just thought I should just briefly mention this. Receptors are like locks and neurotransmitters are like keys. So we have receptor systems, especially in the brain, and these are networks of systems. There are various chemicals, and that each receptor system has its own chemical called neurotransmitter, which is the key. So when that chemical substance goes into that receptor, it turns the system either on, usually activates by turning the key, and opens the system. And so that's how all kinds of functions in our brain happen, through this receptor system and neurotransmitters. But one has to remember that there is not just one key. There can be multiple keys can activate the same lock. So that is why we'll now go back to endocannabinoid system and look at the history of it first. But as you can see from this slide, when there's a neuron, and that normally the body produces certain substances like keys, like anandamide and 2-AG, they go to endocannabinoid system and turn the system on. But THC also fits like a key to the system. Next slide, please. But I think I want to give you a very interesting history of the endocannabinoid system. So if you look at the first year there, 1988, it's not really, as far as medical research goes, it's not really that long ago that something that the humankind has used probably the last 5,000 years, a substance, but our knowledge of it is really far more recent. So in 1988, it was found that there's a specific cannabinoid receptor found in the rat brain. And the reason why it was called cannabinoid is because they discovered that the cannabis plant, THC, basically was like as a key binding to the receptor system there. That's why it's called, so it's got this name. So I always find it very interesting that in nature there is this plant called cannabis, And then our brain has got these, receptor systems, and the key from the plant goes there and goes into that system, can open the lock. So a few years after 1988, CB1 and CB2 receptors were discovered. They named them. In fact, the number is a lot more now. And a year later, the first neurotransmitter, because when you have this receptor system, you also have to find the keys that the body is producing. And the first one that they found was called anandamide. And the second one was discovered a year later. And the word anandamide comes from a Sanskrit word meaning ananda, meaning bliss. So it's got some kind of relations to the cannabis plant, because people, do talk about the sort of being stoned effect, and it's the effect that makes them feel good, and that's why people get addicted to it. Next slide, please. Now, who has this endocannabinoid system? Well, you'll be surprised to hear that even tuberculosis microbes have this system, and fruit flies, and of course, all creatures, all animals, and of course, humans. So what does this suggest? Well, this suggests that the gene must have been present early in the evolution, and its conservation implies that this system is absolutely crucial for our existence, and so therefore it serves very important biological functions. And next slide, please. So where is it? Where is this system? Let's have a look at that now. Tick once more, please. Yeah. Endocannabinoid receptor distribution. Let's look at the brain first. We said they are mainly CB1 and CB2, cannabinoid 1, cannabinoid 2 receptors. CB1s are mostly in the brain, and CB2 is mostly in the body, but they also exist. Both CB1 and CB2 exist also in the body and the brain, vice versa, but predominantly CB1 is in the brain. And where is it? Well, it's almost everywhere in our brain. Cerebral cortex, cerebellum, which is at the back, and especially the limbic area, which is in the midbrain zone. And let's have the next slide with 2 ticks again, please. Yeah. And if we have a cross-sectional look, as you can see, the hippocampus, amygdala, and hypothalamus, that's all in the midsection of the brain. And this system is particularly important because quite a lot of psychiatric disorders stem from this area. Next slide, please. And if you look at the body, mostly CBD, CB2, it's everywhere again. Brainstem, spinal cord, spleen, heart, immune system, endocrine glands, leukocytes, and parts of reproductive, urinary, and gastrointestinal tract. So it's all over. So that also implies that it has many functions, not just one. And interestingly, it's also very highly present in placenta, for instance. It's completely full of CB1 and CB2 receptors, placenta. Next slide, please. So as you can imagine, therefore, this endocannabinoid system, because of its, relatively recent discovery, is one of the most widely distributed and currently researched systems. And also because it involves all the body, brain and the body, and almost all the organs, you can imagine that people are trying to find out about how these organs function, as well as trying to find new medicines. So it regulates, as far as we know, because we still haven't figured out completely what is the role of this endocannabinoid system, but it regulates neuronal, vascular, skeletal, metabolic, immune, and reproductive systems. So it's got all these functions. And also as far as the brain is concerned, it has effects on other neurotransmitter systems like the dopaminergic, GABA, glutamate systems, and which are all associated with psychiatric conditions. I usually say endocannabinoid system is a bit like the control room at an airport. And as you know, in control rooms, they people, it's considered to be one of the most anxiety-provoking jobs, apparently. They decide which airplane should land, which one should take off. So it's a very, very important sort of part of the work there. So, and the cannabinoid system responds according to the state, the chemical state, either to activate or inhibit other systems. And so it sort of regulates all the other systems. So it has an overall umbrella control. Next slide, please. I mentioned that this is one of the most widely researched area, and you can see a very long list of that how people are desperately trying to find new medicines out of exploiting the system, either by activating or inhibiting the system, so that they can get medicines for all these lists. And I won't go through to them, but as you can see, they are very varied medicines. Next slide, please. So I had to mention this endocannabinoid system because, as you can see, it involves the whole body, and it's what we found out that it has got very crucial, significant jobs. So what happens if you smoke cannabis? Well, THC is a key which binds to CB1 receptor. Next slide, please. What we know about CBD is less known. We don't exactly know where it goes, but it is known that it has a potential to reduce the effects of THC if taken together. And so we don't know exact mode of action yet. But we know that CBD targets beyond the endocannabinoid system, and including it has effects on serotonin and opioid receptors as well. Next slide, please. Okay, tick again, please. So what happens when young people use cannabis? This is the bit that I think most of you might be interested in. Next one, please. But first of all, we have to look what is so special about teenagers' brain. Well, let me just give again some information about this, that when at birth, if you look at our neurodevelopment, at birth, each cortical neuron has about 2,500 synapses. Basically, there is a nerve body, cell body, and then there's a long axon. And then at the end of the axon, that there are these dendrites, that's like delta river edges, if you like, and then they connect to another nerve cell. So that's how the one nerve cell is connected to another one. So at birth, we have about 2,500 synapses. But at age 2 to 3, each neuron has about 15,000 synapses. So the number is quite high. And adult brain has about half of these synapses. So the number drops to about roughly 7,500. And as all connections are deleted, which is a process called pruning, and I will explain to you why we need this pruning. And pruning is completed when we are about age 20 to 21, at the end of the adolescence. Next slide, please. So brain development is an organized and highly dynamic multi-step process, and it starts when we are a fetus. And in fact, they have discovered that the endocannabinoid system is very early present when the brain is developing. And so it's genetically determined. It's epigenetically directed, meaning, you know, the embryo, according to embryo codes, that it is directed towards that. And it's also environmentally influenced. So our brain development is based on these three main factors. And adolescence is characterized by dramatic changes in brain growth and connectivity. So that is the time when we reach the age about 11, 12, till about 20, dramatic changes happen in the brain. So it's a critical period for the neurodevelopment of specific, mainly at the front part of the our brain, frontal cortical brain regions. Next slide, please. So brain growth among infants and children is mostly focused essentially on the volume. But what happens in adolescence is the focus shifts from it's not on the volume anymore, but it is more to do with focusing on creating efficient neuronal pathways, because that is why the thinking in children and infants is very different than as we grow up and even in adolescence. So what happens is that synaptic refinement is achieved by pruning some connections and keeping the useful neurons by selection of certain synapses and dendrites. So basically, brain is an economical organ, so it wants to reach somewhere much quicker and without spending much energy, and it requires shortcuts, and it requires this pruning procedure. So this especially happens particularly in the front part of the brain. There's an area called prefrontal cortex, PFC, and it's considered to be one of the most functionally advanced areas, because in the beginning the brain is not fully, of course, developed, and that more functionally complex it becomes, it's mostly in the front part of the brain. And PFC is mainly involved in higher order cognitive processing, such as response selection, decision making, and working memory. And these are really important, and especially with the connections with PFC, prefrontal cortex, and the memory areas and emotion. They are all, these are more higher, what is considered to be higher functioning tasks of the brain. Next slide, please. So adolescent brain is a work in progress brain. So all this change forming into adult brain happens during this phase. And so it goes through massive changes, mainly two changes. One is the loss of gray matter, which is pruning, and also increase in white matter. Gray matter is the part where the cell body or neuronal cell bodies are represented as the gray, because when you look at the brain section, you will see that some parts are gray, some parts are whitish color, and the white bits are the long axons of the cell, so that they are the connections. So what happens that in adolescence, that there's the loss of gray matter and increase in white matter. So we said that this is in order to create a more efficient neural network. So an interference at this phase, because who is responsible from this pruning is considered, as we know from especially animal studies, that synaptic pruning and with cannabis use has been shown in animal studies. We know that endocannabinoid receptor system is involved with this process. In fact, right from the outset, when we are even in fetuses, that the brain development is one of the functions of ECS, endocannabinoid system. So an interference at this phase might represent a risk for mental disorders. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I was saying, animal studies confirm that endocannabinoid signaling is present during the gestational period and is an integral part of the morphogenesis of the neurons and axons. And in fact, I was reading that even the sucking action of a baby, or even in animals, it's been shown is to do with CB1 receptors or endocannabinoid system. This reflex of sucking the milk, maternal milk, and the maternal milk also has got a lot of anandamide, which has been found recently, and that it is activated by the endocannabinoid system, so that babies suck their mother's milk, and this oral motor function is activated by the endocannabinoid system. And then two processes may be adversely affected by exposure to cannabis during this process. One is not synaptic pruning, and the other is white matter development, as we mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So what happens? Interference with this process, as you can imagine, we talked about the prefrontal cortex and the higher functioning, executive functioning tasks of this area. And so interference with this system can affect attention, impulse control, and executive functioning, such as planning and decision making. And when they were normally expected to develop gradually from age 11, 12 to 20. Next slide, please. Now, just to concentrate a bit more on this prefrontal cortex area, a good functioning of adult PFC is dependent on a delicate balance. If you just want to go into a little bit more detail of this, the chemistry of it. So there's, at one side, you have the GABAergic, mostly inhibitory neurotransmitter system, and then you have the excitatory glutamergic system. So endocannabinoid system is like a balance point that, you know, when either exciting the system or inhibiting the system. So this system controls this balance to prevent excessive release of some calcium minerals. So THC disrupts this protective effect of ECS. So endocannabinoid system, by controlling this either too inhibited or too excited modes, protects the brain. But THC disrupts this protective effect. And it has been postulated that THC induces psychotic states by disrupting this system. In fact, there is quite a number of researchers now looking at this excitatory and inhibitory balance of neural networks, because previously schizophrenia research mostly has been focusing on the dopaminergic system, because the medicines, were mostly affecting the dopaminergic system. But since then, the focus is moving to other areas and looking at, because brain is a very complex organ, so you can't really talk about one system only, because they're all related to each other. So it's exciting research will come out of this, and the role of endocannabinoid system will even be more forefront. Next slide, please. So one kind of impact, as you said, this PFC area deals with complex tasks. There's been an interesting research I thought I should mention, which was just published this year. They looked at 3 groups of 15 to 16-year-olds, teenagers. And group 1 was a chronic heavy cannabis users, and group 2 occasional users, and group 3 involved non-users. But what they found out that there was a significant decrease in performance in working memory tasks and processing speed by subjects using cannabis heavily on a daily basis compared to other 2 groups. So this even shows how using cannabis at this age can have an impact on people's normal functioning of this area. Next slide, please. And this graph also shows in the graph that the dark blue one is the group 1, the heavily using group, as you can see, and the differences between in working memory, processing speed, and intelligence quotient also. It has made some difference in these studies, and there are some other studies affecting schoolwork as well, or the school performance in Canada when they followed up group of students. Next slide, please. So it's not just mental health or illness, if you like, it's also mental functioning, normal functioning can be affected. Let's look at this to another way, another very interesting recent population survey, over 36 and nearly to over 36,000 people. If earlier use is compared with later cannabis use and the links with psychotic illness. Interestingly, when they looked at the adults aged between 18 to 34, if they used cannabis during this age time, which is sort of towards the very later stages of teenagehood, they did not find a link between a development of a psychotic illness and cannabis use. But when they looked at the cannabis use in early and late adolescence, that it was consistently associated with schizophrenia and psychosis. So this also kind of shows, I mean, we have now no doubt that all epidemiological and biological studies show link between cannabis use and psychosis. I'll come back to that later. But early use is particularly important and crucial. And it is because of the specific characteristics we talked about of the adolescent brain. Next slide, please. And can earlier use of cannabis bring forward the onset of psychotic illness? And this was an interesting systematic meta-analysis, meaning many studies are around the same subject is being gathered and reanalyze the data so that they can have a meaningful result. And so they looked at 443 articles, and 83 studies met the inclusion criteria. And they analyzed the results of these 83 studies, and they found that the age of onset was brought forward by 2.7 years among samples of cannabis users. So basically, if you use cannabis, your chances of having a psychotic illness at an earlier age is quite high. Next slide, please. You'll be ticking here again, Laura, a few times. So this is just a synaptic pruning during adolescence and then fine-tuning of receptor function. If it is disrupted by THC, tick again, please. Then possibly, excessive stimulation of ECS by THC may lead to increased connections between logically unrelated ideas. For instance, some patients might see a sign and immediately it may mean something completely different to them. So they give a meaning to that object, which has nothing to do with the object itself. So it is thought that, you know, it disrupts this system and the synaptic plasticity is affected. All right, next slide, please. But we also have to ask this question, because this is a question I also have been very much interested in. So why not every teenager who uses cannabis does not develop a psychotic illness? Because we know that, I mean, they may be very slow a bit and a bit sort of don't care much about, not motivated to do things, or a bit lazy looking, and a bit sort of neglecting their looks, or I'm generalizing, not everyone, but it may change some things, but they don't become psychotic necessarily. Next slide, please. Well, we need to look at genetic studies, because we need to know who's vulnerable and who isn't, especially when there's now a significant movement towards legalization of cannabis around the world, led by United States. And it is important to know who's particularly vulnerable to the psychogenic effects of cannabis in the young. Well, gene-environment interaction studies have mainly focused on genetic variants involved in the regulation of the dopaminergic system, because historically, as I mentioned before, people thought that this, especially psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia, is involved with the dopaminergic system. Next slide, please. I just gave you here a list of genes so far associated with the increased risk of development of a psychotic illness with cannabis use. I'm not going to go through to them. Basically, there are quite a lot of genes involved or suspected to be important especially in schizophrenia. But none of these genes are yet, you cannot have a gene test saying if you have this gene, you'll be susceptible to the psychogenic of cannabis. We're not there yet, but maybe in future it will be, one day we will be a bit more clear about especially which genes we have. I also believe that some of us may have protective genes, not just genes that are making us ill, also amount of genes that protect you from getting ill. So we need to know that, and we don't yet know that. But I just gave you a list there that's been studied so far, but there's no evidence-based information on that yet. Next slide, please. So it's not just genes, of course. It's genes are very important, but also urbanicity, or living in very dense city areas, or going through early childhood trauma is also has been associated with cannabis use, so, and leading to increased risk of psychosis. So in fact, most psychiatric disorders are like that, that you are, you know, you are born with certain set of genes, and then on top of that, you have environmental factors coming in, and environmental factors can either be for or against your gene structure. So if you have a vulnerability for certain disorders, then that comes out, or it doesn't if you have maybe environmental factors are more in your favor. So it's a delicate balance there. But sometimes also it's important to say that the genetic side can be either very loaded or very mild. So if you have genetic loaded, even if you live in a very good environment with no childhood trauma, you can still become ill if you have a loaded genetic makeup. Next slide, please. So even healthy subjects are differently affected by THC. As I said before in our research, when we gave 10 milligrams of THC to people and 600 milligrams of CBD and placebo, what we found, 1/3 of our subjects, healthy volunteers, developed transient psychotic symptoms. And they were, I have to tell you, it wasn't at all pleasant to see healthy volunteers. They were mostly medical students, and they suddenly became paranoid, seeing things, hallucinating, and we had made them like that. It was very unpleasant, but all of them recovered within 3 hours, and we followed them up, and they were fine. And we had, in fact, carefully chosen them. They had no family history of psychosis, but so 1/3 of subjects became psychotic, but the other 2/3, with 10 milligrams of THC, they just felt fine. You know, they enjoyed it, in fact, and so it didn't make them psychotic. So when we looked at their brains and activation when they were doing a response inhibition task, what we found that basically transiently psychotic group showed less activation compared to non-psychotic group in certain parts of the brain, basically in the right temporal gyrus and cerebellum. So THC was behaving very differently in this group. So those people had not become psychotic, but the effect was very different. So even, you know, when you're not maybe genetically loaded, it has the potential to make some of us psychotic for a temporary period. Next slide, please. So let's look at the at-risk groups, because especially when now the cannabis is available everywhere, especially in the United States, as far as I know, you need to find out who is particularly at risk to develop psychosis. And this is on the basis of the studies that's been carried out so far. So predisposition to psychosis is one factor, but how do we know this? Well, unfortunately, we don't have a gene test yet, but family history of psychotic illness is one clue to see that there may be a link. And also presence of some subclinical psychotic symptoms, or people who are experiencing some or voicing some psychotic-like complaints. And in most, this can be temporary. This is without cannabis, basically. But I mean, these are if someone is saying, "Oh, I hear things," or they are a bit more suspicious, and then they go use cannabis, so that's a bit more risky. This is what I'm trying to say. And personality, this has been found in a number of studies. If you have a schizotypal personality disorder, which is defined in DSM-5 as well, which is someone who really is a bit introvert, and their social relationships aren't as sort of open and easy. And so that has been linked to if they use cannabis, they will be considered at risk. And also the certain genes, especially the AKT1 seems to be maybe a candidate, but we are not yet, as I said, certain about that. Next slide, please. So let's look at the evidence, how strong the evidence we have about cannabis and psychosis. Well, younger age use been associated with high risk. So we have, for this, we have epidemiological, neurobiological, and genetic studies have confirmed that younger age use is associated with higher risk. So the thing to take from this would be really to ask teenagers not to use cannabis. And I know it's an extremely difficult task because teenage time is the time when people is usually brave because of the way that pruning and the hormones are working, that they are daring and not really fearing things that adult people would fear. And they are fearless. I mean, I'm making generalizations, but they are the kind of characteristics of teenage years. So it is a difficult task, but young age carries a high risk, as we talked in this session. And so we also have very strong evidence on THC interfering with synaptic plasticity, meaning interfering with the synaptic pruning. So we've got, again, epidemiological, neurobiological, and genetic research confirming this. And those with familial risk have higher sensitivity. So we have some evidence of that. And also THC CBD dose is critical. I'm sure that this was covered in other webinars. I noticed that because in an average plant there is a balance between THC and CBD. If THC is high, CBD would be low, or if CBD is high, THC would be low. So unfortunately, what is available in UK and I'm sure also in United States is that high THC is more popular because it makes you more stoned, or the effect is stronger, and therefore the risk is a lot higher. And early life events and cannabis use also has some evidence of not as high as the other factors that I just listed. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, if we look at a genetically low risk individual, let's say from the birth and that during the critical neurodevelopment that they use cannabis at the age of, say, 17 or 16, and synaptic plasticity, and there's some minimal or no structural changes happen to them if they are genetically low risk individual. Next slide, please. But if the person is genetically high risk individual, and if there's especially environmental risk or familial risk, which would come maybe with genetic risk as well, and they use cannabis at the critical neurodevelopment phase during teenagehood, then increase, maybe structural changes happen, and which leads to psychosis. So that's kind of a model to keep in mind. And the next one, please. So in summary, just want to summarize my talk. I hope I haven't, I kept your interest in it. Cannabis is chemically a complex plant, and the cannabinoid system, which is fascinating, is essential for our survival and has many significant functions in the body and in the brain. And adolescent brain is a work in progress brain, and the cannabinoid system has a significant role in developing the brain into adult form. So heavy THC use during this phase, during adolescence, can disrupt the development of adult brain and may impact upon cognitive functioning and mental health. So I thought I should mention cognitive functioning too. Next slide, please. And it is thought that THC induces psychotic states by disrupting this excitatory and inhibitory balance of neural networks. because this involves, quite a lot of areas, and especially which happens in the front part. However, not everyone who uses cannabis develops psychotic illness for a number of reasons, including having genetic vulnerability or certain type of personality, or living in urban areas and experiencing early trauma. So I think on that note, I finish. And the next slide, please. Thank you. And I'm ready for your questions, if any, please.
Wonderful. Oh, and we have a lot of questions. I will stop showing the screen here and come back on and talk with you. Wow, I'm going to have to watch this like 3 times again, just to track all of the science.
It wasn't repetitive, was it? Or was it?
No.
Was it?
No, not at all. There were so many things that you discussed, especially with excitatory and inhibitory. We haven't talked about a lot of the effects of glutamate and GABA, and you went into far more detail than I've seen any of our other presenters do. So I'm going to have to try to go through it and understand it and do some more reading. But to me, it makes so much sense as to why some teens can use the marijuana and not have an effect. But I did like your distinction between mental health and mental functioning, because we do see, even if they don't become psychotic, the IQ scores, the lack of motivation, the laziness, sort of as you refer to it, versus mental health. And I really like that distinction, and I'm going to explore that more in some future work. So thank you for that. And a lot of other questions coming from some others. So I will just, as I promised, read these in the order that we got them.
Answer.
Okay, so I see long-time users around my age of 74 who, while not having had a psychosis, have nonetheless grown irrational in their thinking with a lot of paranoia. So Zerrin, I know we were focusing, of course, specifically on the adolescent brain, but what have you seen also in adults with chronic long-term use?
Yeah. Now, chronic long-term use, I mean, it has, there are varying views about this research. Some researchers say that there are changes in cognitive functioning. What we mean by cognitive functioning is that all the sort of executive functioning that we have, which involves memory, decision making, inhibition of response, or sort of stopping ourselves from doing something wrong, all those things. So more complex brain tasks, basically.
Okay.
Some researchers believe that there's a permanent change which cannot even, correct itself even if you stop using cannabis. And some people say that if you stop, those functions come back, because the brain is also a plastic organ. But we also know that, I mean, I need to ask that person if they had been using it all the time. But sorry, before I say that, I should say this. These changes can be so subtle that it may not be noticed. It may not affect daily functioning.
Okay.
Because there are other things that brain makes up for, or our behavior makes up for. So unless they are very carefully tested, people can go look like normal. But what I think that question is telling me is that, what is it that they are smoking? Because if they were smoking, say, in the 60s, 80s, 70s, the cannabis they were smoking is very different from what they are buying today, unless they know exactly how much they are smoking. Because we know that the potential in skunk, what we call in UK skunk, I don't think you use that word very much, I believe, in the States. Skunk means basically is an umbrella term for very strong high THC potent cannabis. If they are using that, of course, it may make them suspicious and paranoid. So it may be different from what they were using before.
Okay. And also, yeah, he said he struggles after 50 years, so I think it's permanent. It was 3%, but it was 24/7 for 2 years straight.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so that person obviously is not genetically loaded for any psychotic illness, so he was lucky in that way. But I would imagine that maybe some, there's also changes, of course, due to age. We lose a lot of nerve cells in the brain as
Right.
and plus, using cannabis, if it's especially heavy use, daily use, and potent cannabis use, is bound to affect one's psychological state as well as cognitive state.
Okay. Let's see. Someone asked here, what are terpenes?
Oh, terpenes are the things that gives the scent of a plant, for instance. So now what they are doing, I mean, they are using, about the market of CBD and everything else.
Yes.
Terpenes are very potent, in fact, if they are added to the substance itself, it makes you want more. So that is why they are very important, because as you know, cannabis plant has a specific scent and taste. So terpenes provide that. So when they are coupled with the actual THC, the impact is even more, because you are sort of seeking for that conditioning. So terpenes are chemicals again, which gives the scent and taste of products.
Okay, thank you. What other substances affect the cannabinoid system? You said it is important. Why is it important without marijuana?
Yes, I mean, it controls the whole body.
So are
And
there other substances besides marijuana that affect it? Do we know? Or is it just happens to be marijuana? The one thing that influences our endocannabinoid system.
Yes, well, it's mostly endocannabinoids is called endocannabinoid because of the cannabis plant. As you know, the word is taken from there. But interestingly, there is this herbal medicine called, I can't pronounce it, euthanasia?
Oh yeah, yeah.
That also binds to TB1 receptor.
And the K2, the spice, some of the new, synthetic.
Well, they do. The synthetic cannabinoids do as well. I mean, I'm talking about this
The
other
natural echinacea, yeah.
but it doesn't cause any problem. So obviously, I mean, very little research is on that, but they know that it can bind to CB1 receptor, but it doesn't cause. I mean, so it's very. I think what we know, our human mind is so it cannot think too complex things, and we are always trying to find out or understand or think that there are simple connections between things. But more I find about this, more I discover how complex it is.
Wow.
And
yes.
And the keys can even do, same key goes into the lock but does a different work. Yeah.
Okay, wow. Is ADD or ADHD something that can bring on or be a precursor of developing psychosis if a teen is using THC? What's the moderation of ADHD and THC and the teen brain?
I mean, there are some sort of talks about ADHD and psychosis link, but I haven't seen anything counting having ADHD as a risk for psychosis. But I know that people with ADHD can they have a tendency wanting to use cannabis, so they are more at risk for using cannabis. But it is not considered as one of the risk groups at the same time. I have not seen such research. Maybe someone needs to research that. Maybe there is a risk, but I haven't seen that.
Okay. Do the structural changes in the brain result from longer synapse connections from heavy use? In other words, does THC abuse create a short circuit?
No, I mean, it's just what we know, that it disrupts what is known as that, because it disrupts so your brain doesn't develop like it should take a shortcut. So it doesn't take the shortcut. It has too many connections, and that's why people give, I mean, that is what is postulated. That is why psychosis develops, because you're giving too many meanings to things, thinking like a child sometimes. It's a bit like childlike thinking. You know, children think more in, they can't think abstract. They find links between things, which we know that, well, it's okay for children, but not for adults, if you know what I mean. So
Yes.
the thinking is not quite like a child thinking, but at the same time, the links aren't logical either. When you speak to someone who has psychosis, talking about things that doesn't exist in reality, because what they are seeing is their reality. They are seeing a link quite clearly, or hearing things. So it's that kind of link.
I read recently scientists postulating that perhaps during the pruning process that THC can actually accidentally speed up pruning or prune away some things that perhaps you might have later wanted. Have you heard of this latest theory, and have you heard of this sped up pruning?
No, I
Okay.
haven't. Most of these studies are based on animal studies so far,
Right.
because it's
It was rats. Yeah.
to,
Okay.
to do, yeah, to relate to, but it does make sense though, because
Yeah.
disruption means either some of them are, you know, not cut, or some of them are overcut, if you
Right.
like.
Or just cut incorrectly, whether under or over, I guess. That's fascinating to me. Let's see. I'm wondering about the age of the adolescent formation. In the US, we talk a lot about 25 for girls and up to 30 for boys. In your talk, you spoke mostly of around 20, 21. Does that imply that by 21, when in the US, for most states that legalize recreational marijuana, they can use at the age of 21. Does that mean that mostly it's safe if they wait until 21, or is it still a good idea to wait till 25 to up to 30?
Well, we're talking about here brain development, not, you know, the age for cannabis use, but brain development is according to research, finishes about age 21. So it begins from 11. I mean, it varies, of course, when someone is going into puberty, and even it's getting younger and younger if you look at the sort of general population around the world, for various reasons, I guess. But it's 21 is the time usually. I mean, there's no exact cutoff points about these things. I'm sure there's individual variations, but it is considered when the brain development is expected to come to an end, 21.
Okay.
So if someone is smoking cannabis, as I showed the research there, which they showed that if they use cannabis even from age 18 onwards, they couldn't find a link between cannabis and psychosis, but they did find a link between cannabis and psychosis if people use cannabis as a teenager. It was in one of the slides. So age is important to show the link between cannabis, and age of use is important.
And so at least to encourage our teens to, you know,
Yes.
delay, and then maybe by the time they're 21, they won't want to use it all. And a follow-up question around there.
I mean, if it was a weak, not strong cannabis, if it was weak cannabis, and if you are aged like 22 or onwards, it's in fact less harmful than alcohol.
Okay.
In my
So
view.
how do we, you said correctly, you know, teens think they know everything. They're very, you know, they take lots of risks. They're living, how, you know, the question is, how do we avoid kind of scare tactics? You know, a lot of the campaigns from the past, especially here in the US, use, you know, this is your brain on drugs. You know, how do we best message this very complex subject and the real need for them to understand what's going to happen in their brains to teens and not use these scare tactics? Do you have recommendations for that?
I think it's the age of education that is important. I think if someone is a teenager and you try to educate them about drugs, it's too late.
Okay. And that's
I
why we try to target middle school at Johnny's Ambassadors, you know, 5th, 6th, 7th grade, 11, 12. It's not too young
yeah.
to begin.
Well, I gave, in fact, it was one of my most difficult talks to primary school kids.
Oh,
And in my area where I live in London, where quite a lot of people smoke cannabis, and it was very interesting. I mean, it was difficult for me because I really had to be speaking in very, very simple, basic terms to tell them. And you should have seen their faces, you know, at the end. And because in the beginning, I asked them if they knew about cannabis, and they said, oh, my mother smokes it, my father, my brother, my sister, they all knew about it. But when I talked to them about the brain, I showed sort of some simple animation pictures and stuff. They were so interested, and I could see from their face that they did not want an interference with their brain at primary school. And I never forget the impact of it. I mean, I hope I at least prevented some of them from trying. But
yeah.
I think early as possible, because they get imprinted with that, and then they know, and it is, you know, given to them. Because by the time they are teenagers, it may be a little late, because it's in our blood then to want to have adventures and to try different things. But if
Okay.
it is something
Yeah.
is very strongly embedded in you, you're less likely to try it. But even if you try it, I mean, maybe to encourage them to use weaker ones, weaker forms, and go for that if they want to see, and to be open about it, because having punishing or punitive tone does not work, definitely.
Well, and I think that's, you know, one of the reasons we're trying to educate parents, you know, and so what I hear you saying is make sure you start young, be very honest about the brain development
Yeah.
specifically, and teach them that rather than just you know, that's bad
Yeah.
and thou shalt not, and things like that, that they appreciate the neuroscience and they
Yeah.
wouldn't want to hurt their brains.
I'll give you another example. I was asked to see this man in a locked ward. He was in a secure unit because he had done some dangerous stuff, and they were ready to discharge him, but they couldn't because he was continuing to cannabis being delivered to the ward somehow, and he was smoking it. They couldn't discharge him for that reason. So when I saw him, saw I saw that he was beyond help. You know, he was so keen on using cannabis. So I thought, as I'm here, I'll give him some information. So I drew pictures. I described the endocannabinoid system, and towards the end, when as I was leaving, he said, "I've never forgotten that. Well, I'll ask them to bring me less strong stuff." So no one likes their brain to be interfered with.
Okay, that's a great message.
Yeah.
We have several more questions. We're at the end of our time. I don't want to take advantage. Do you have a few more minutes to spend with us?
Of course, yeah, no problem.
Okay, so I know many people need to disconnect at this time. We're going to just take a few more minutes with Dr. Atakan while we have her here. How can marijuana be less harmful than alcohol? Does alcohol cause psychosis? I have a friend who is 51 who was psychotic, who came to Colorado and used a dab pen from a girlfriend. She took 2 hits on it, and she was in the mental hospital for 2 weeks hallucinating, and thought her caretakers were shapeshifters. I mean, she told me the story later, and it was unreal. Do you see that in alcohol? Can alcohol cause that kind of psychosis also?
It's not, I mean, alcohol is known to cause Korsakoff psychosis. That's kind of, you know, it can happen. But alcohol is more dangerous because it kills you. That's why I said it. You know, clinically, it has the potential to kill you and cause and lead to all kinds of other organ failures and problems. And from cirrhosis to, I mean, there's the Korsakoff psychosis happens with alcohol use, but it is rare, but it does happen. But
Yeah.
I said it is less harmful in chemically. If you use very low dose cannabis, moderately, it's less harmful than alcohol. That's what
it
I
can kill you.
thought.
Okay. Do you
And because
have there what we see here in the U.S. with the very high potency THC, the 90% plus wax and shatters, and where people come in with the cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, they have died from the cyclical vomiting that they can't stop, and severe dehydration, and we do have people who die from that. Do you see that where you are? Do you have such stuff that is so high in potency?
no,
Okay. I just
that I-
wondered. Yeah, there's
no.
the big thing here with CHS and
I suspect they are also, putting all kinds of other stuff in them. I mean, if they purchased it, they are mixed with some other stuff in it.
oh, these are our chronic, high frequency, high potency users who are just using cannabis, and when they stop using, then the CHS miraculously goes away. And then if they start using it again, then they call it scromiting. They come into the emergency room screaming and vomiting.
I never heard that. No.
Oh, I'll send you some articles on this CHS. It's a big thing in emergency rooms here in the US.
I think it's all related to availability. There is far more than it is here.
Everywhere.
Here it's only underground. Yeah.
It's everywhere. Is there an explanation for a psychotic episode that a teen had using THC, but no family history, no trauma, no signs? Is it completely random? Like you described in your study, how 1/3 had a response to THC?
That's right. You see, one does not need to have a family history of psychosis. Your genes are just like a potluck. The way that the genes come together, you can just have a mutation in some of them, which can then lead to, with no family history, but in that person is carrying a genetic load. That's what happens. It doesn't have to, you don't have to have a family history.
You don't have to have a family history, but you could still have some combination of genes that for you create. What about, and I saw on your slide, like the schizoid, the schizotype personality disorder. Is that for you, or is that for your parents, your grandparents? What's
the person has been diagnosed with schizotypal personality, that they found in number of research that they had higher risk to, if they use cannabis, that they would develop a psychotic illness. I mean, it's kind of considered that personality in the spectrum of sort of psychosis a bit, because they are a bit sort of antisocial and a bit not psychopathic. That's not what I mean. Meaning, they're shy socially. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's so interesting. Are violent tendencies trackable through THC abuse? Have you studied that? Is there some measurable overdose amount where people might become violent? Have you seen any research on violence? Sometimes here in the US, we get news reports of, so-and-so tested positive for marijuana and they did something violent. Do you know of any research on that?
There is some. I mean, that the increase of violence increases with heavy cannabis use, because it's usually because it makes you suspicious. When you are suspicious, what do? We attack or we run away, but usually people become suspicious, and it comes from that degree of paranoia that you become, but in fact, generally people can become slowed down, but if they are suspicious, they would react to
that kind of fight or flight kind of thing that goes along with paranoia.
I mean, in my experience, in fact, because I had, I used to look after an intensive psychiatric care unit where it was a locked ward with people with violence and psychosis were being treated. I worked there for 13 years.
Wow.
And most people don't like being violent. They hate it because it's not a nice state to be suspicious, paranoid, and attacking people. But people only attack, really, I mean, unless you're a sociopath, which is which we didn't deal with those, but
Right.
it's not a nice state. But people only attack when they are afraid and suspicious.
Okay, wow. Brain science is so complex, someone said here. How can we simplify our language so that it's accessible to parents and the youth audience? Is it appropriate to say, for example, your teen's brain is undergoing massive remodeling,
Yeah.
making it vulnerable? So how do you explain to teens about the wiring and the pathways that just make it a little more understandable? Do you have some sentences that you use that would be
Yes,
helpful?
I think that is such a good point. Unfortunately, the brain is a complex organ, like the plant
Yes,
is
like she said, yeah.
so complex. But I think the if you can maybe, I think the words that the person who asked the question said is really nice. The way that he or she described it.
Okay.
It's, I mean, I can say usually the way I say it is that brain is an economical organ, is lazy, doesn't want to spend too much energy, wants to take shortcuts. And it's true, even our thinking patterns is like that, because if we've learned a certain thinking pattern, brain uses that. And if you want to change that thinking pattern, brain has to work harder. So basically what cannabis is doing is preventing these shortcuts in some ways that, the way that the brain wants to work. So I think what one can say is that when your brain will be fully developed when you're age 21, 22, and until then your brain is a work in progress brain. It's working hard. And maybe you can talk about pruning roses. If you prune roses, what happens? You get better roses, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
great.
maybe
Yeah,
you
that's a
can
great
make a rose
analogy.
like that. Yeah, you get nice flowers and new shoots, and the rose plant gets nicer and prettier. So that's why brain needs pruning. I mean, I think pruning is a good word, because there are these long axons and they are being cut, and so it's maybe that analogy could be used, in
I like
order for to function between your age this and that, you need to really look after your brain.
and that the THC disrupts that.
Protect your mental
Yeah.
thinking capacity, school success, performance, and your mental health.
All right, last question. We finally got to the end of all the questions. What is the impact on the fetal development when either the mother or the father uses, you mentioned there's a concentration of the endocannabinoid system in the fetus. What's the impact if the father used, if the mother used, or if they continue to use? What's the recommendation there?
Well, it's very. Yasmin Hurd, who I met, came to our conference that I talked to you about earlier.
Yeah.
She did a lot of studies with when women who smoked cannabis when they were pregnant, and then they had miscarriages. So she examined their fetuses, the brains, and they noticed some structural changes in the brain of the fetus. So it goes, and so it's and even if the mother is continuing to smoke, and the father, so basically not the father but the mother, if they use cannabis, I mean, maybe she would inhale if the father is smoking, but the impact of mothers smoking cannabis when they are pregnant, there are structural changes in the brain. And I mean, because these studies are new, that they are undergoing, also looking at how these structural changes will go into functional changes, are still being studied. But we do know that there are some changes happen.
Wow. Well, the remainder of all the comments that are left are thank you, thank you, thank you. Awesome presentation, great information. Dr. Atakan, Zerrin, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the time that you spent with me early
So
on. Truly, our conversation was one of the things that inspired me to start Johnny's Ambassadors, and I'm so grateful.
You're an inspiration, Laura. I really mean that. You are yourself. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And if we can help one or two people, that will be a bonus.
That's exactly right. That's what we're here to do. If one person hears this message and makes a change, then we've done our work. Thank you so much again.
Please for giving me this opportunity. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
We will stay in touch. Take care, everyone.
And I want to see your book. All right, bye.
Yeah, well, I'll be sending you a copy. You just wait.
All right.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.